Hi, Rajan. Good morning.
Good morning, Andrea.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Andrea Bergeron. I'm Wolastoqey, and I'm also a Conservation Project Officer for the FNQ LSDI. And today I'll be hosting this webinar with my colleague, Réjean Dumas. Réjean is a Conservation Strategic Advisor for the FNQ LSDI, and he's also been appointed Regional Nature Coordinator by the AFNQL. Réjean, would you like to tell us a bit more about this role that you have?
Of course, Andrea. Well, the regional coordinator job is linked to a nature table that is nationwide, so all of Canada, that will be created early next year, probably in February. And there are coordinators in each of Canada's regions. And the task is basically to act as a, let's say, communication agent between the communities and the nature table. So basically to bring the concerns of the communities to the nature table regarding the global biodiversity framework, and also to bring information from the table to the communities.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Réjean. So in today's webinar, we'll ask ourselves the question, why should we be interested in the Kunming-Montréal Global Biodiversity Framework? And we'll do that by conducting an interview in which we will do an overview of all the 23 targets for this framework. But first, we'll begin with a quick introduction presentation on COP15. So Réjean, if you'd like to go on with that, the floor is yours.
What do you want, Gamache, Andrea? We're going to do this in the form of a good old slideshow. There's going to be a short delay so that we can share the screen. And basically, we're going to have a few images about COP15 and how great it was. So COP15 was held in Montreal just before last Christmas. And basically, we often hear about COP15 and COP27. Basically, COP15 is linked to the biodiversity framework, whereas COP27 is linked to the climate change agreement. As we can see, we're both flooded in water. So we're going to talk about COP15. It was just before Christmas in Montreal, and already there was a nice snow cover. There were two zones. Basically, there is a blue zone that is restricted, where only representatives from the countries or different organizations were allowed, and a green zone that was accessible to the public. And if we look first at what was going on in the blue zone, first, it was opened by Sid Hill, a Grand Chief of the Onondaga Nation, which basically set the tone that First Nations were not only extremely important in COP15, but only they're key to its success. And then followed by Prime Minister Trudeau, who was interrupted by a group of young people from First Nations, reminding that we have a genocide situation in Canada. And then followed by Prime Minister Legault, Mairesse Plante from Montreal. And we talk about the Kunming-Montréal biodiversity framework because it was supposed to be held in Kunming in China 2 years before in 2020, and because of COVID, then it was postponed. So there was the first day there was an event held by China, which was kind of a welcoming event. Members from the Institute were present at the COP, and there was a booth that was held there. You probably can recognize several faces there. And then let's say the main activities at the COP are held in a very large room that can hold several thousand people. And every time someone wants to speak, there is a certain time allowed that is well indicated at the front of the room. And usually people, they will respect the time that they're given, but sometimes they don't, and they just can keep on talking until they're done and their messages are, let's say, transmitted. There were several ways of expressing their concerns within the secured area. There is no, let's say, limit of expression of hair color. There's no limit in age. There's some food that's being provided. There are a lot of booths. This one is the Chinese booth that was very well organized. There were a lot of panels. There were over 200 different, what were called side events on different topics. And most of them were under the form of panels. Some panels are, let's say, the time to express different concerns. Just remember that certain countries, they can witness some pretty extreme situations. Every evening, there were some different artists, mostly musicians, that were entertaining the crowd, well, a certain part of the crowd, while the others were still working hard on negotiations. Now, if we go to the green zone that was accessible to the public, there again, there were different booths. This one is from Laval University, explaining bog ecology. So it was a good occasion for young people to familiarize themselves with ecology and biology. There was a pretty good media coverage of the entire event. Some funnier than others, and in this case, human is being judged under jury of endangered species that declared the human guilty. There were large events that were offered to the public. Some of them were, let's say, the occasion to deliver key messages about protecting biodiversity. There was a very large public march that was organized in the streets of Montreal. Now, going back to the blue zones, every day there were press conferences that were held by different parties to report on the progress of the negotiations. The way that the COP was operating, as I was saying earlier, there were, let's say, there's a main room where all the representatives are, and then the text, because the global biodiversity framework, what we're going to be going over, the different targets, has been basically discussed, analyzed, and negotiated basically word by word and comma by comma. And it's here we can see there's a screen where the text is projected, and basically all of the different amendments that are brought to the text are shown here in red until there's everybody agrees on the final text, which will be brought back to the larger room where the texts are approved. There were some key moments. This one is by the Minister of Colombia, the Environment Minister of Colombia, basically reminding us that through all the negotiations, we have to put life first. And this one was right at the end of the COP, after, let's say, 2 weeks of discussions, and this young person from the First Nations that represents the CBD Alliance was reminding us that we cannot solve the biodiversity crisis using the same system that caused it. And that was quite an enlightening moment. And then there was this moment when the Environment Minister of China declared that the text was adopted. And basically, the text has a mission, and let's say a midterm mission. It's in 7 years, in 2030, that we have to halt the biodiversity loss, and by 2050 to, let's say, see on the planet biodiversity that is valued, recognized, and that can, let's say, perpetuate itself. So those are the two texts. There is in French reminding us that in Quebec, what we see is a text that is in French, but the original text is in English, and it's been translated in 5 other different languages. So, Andrea, that kind of gives us an overview of how the COP was going on. Let's say a closer insight into the everyday action.
Yes, thank you, Rajan. And like you said, I think it gives a really good idea of the context in which this framework was written. So thank you for that quick introduction presentation on the COP15. So we'll now be able to move on to the framework itself. So we'll go over the 23 targets. And those targets are divided between 3 blocks, so 3 main themes. The first one is about reducing threats to biodiversity. So, Réjean, for this first block of targets, could you tell me which are the 3 best-known targets or the 3 targets that have been more discussed in the media recently?
Yeah, well the main one, the one that we heard the most about and keep hearing about, is target number 3, about protecting 30% of the territory, whether they are actually protected areas or other effective conservation measures. But that's number 3, so it means that there are 2 more, and we could say in hockey terms that's like a power trio. And number 1 is about spatial planning, and we can recognize First Nation values, thinking more holistically about 100% of the territory. And number 2 is telling us that a lot of the territory has been degraded. And here the target has been set pretty high at restoring 30% of degraded areas. And that's by 2030. So it's not to having it restored, but to engage in the restoration on 30% of degraded areas, which in terms of, let's say, realistic target, it's quite overwhelming.
Yeah, I definitely look forward to seeing this happening, and we've heard about that in the media, so it's really something to look for. All right, so moving on now, we're talking about biodiversity, and when I'm thinking of biodiversity, I'm thinking species right away. So what would be the targets related to species in this framework?
Well, Andrea, we have another trio there in terms of species. Target number 4 is about halting the extinction of species. And again, that's a pretty ambitious target because the rate of extinction of species is really high right now. And it means that in 7 years, when we think about Quebec, we think about caribou, and we think about forest caribou, and some of those populations are really on the border of going extinct. And what this target is telling us is that we should do everything that we can so that it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So, some species are going well and can support a harvest, and obviously species, animals, plants are key to not only the survival of First Nations, but since time immemorial, their livelihood. So target number 5 is telling us that this can still go on and it must be sustainable. Target number 6 is bringing, let's say, more actual concerns about invasive species, especially alien species, so species that come from other territories. And we know that there are more and more of those species, and they're not necessarily large species. They can be, let's say, a disease. They can be an insect, and it's this target aims at not only, let's say, dealing with those alien species that are already on the territory, but also preventing new introductions.
Okay, and you know, those invasive alien species, we know that they thrive with climate change, right? Because it favors their survival. And so since we are today in a period of climate change and it's becoming more and more pressing by the day, is the framework addressing climate change in any way?
Yeah. Like we've seen, there's a specific COP on climate change, but climate change is one of the main factors on the planet that is a threat to biodiversity. So climate change could not be just, let's say, excluded just because it is addressed by let's call it the other COP. So there are a group of actions that must be undertaken under this COP on biodiversity, and that's what Target 8 is all about. We're saying that we must adapt to climate change, but species cannot all adapt. They can move or they can vanish because they are not able to face climate, the climate, let's say, the stress that is induced by climate change.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the root of climate change, which is pollution, because often we talk about a lot about carbon emissions, but there are different mechanisms that trigger climate change on the planet. And basically, pollution is the main driver of climate change. So if we want to mitigate and reduce what is the threat that is that climate change bring, that means that we have to reduce pollution. And pollution, no one will, let's say, think that pollution is just something that is not true. So everybody see pollution, everybody can smell pollution, everybody can feel pollution. Pollution still causes a lot of death, even in Canada, in the cities, among humans. So everybody recognizes the threat that is caused by pollution.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see more measures to control pollution in the future.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned that there's a cup for biodiversity. There's a framework for biodiversity. There was a cup also for climate change, but it's interesting to see just how they are treated in different subjects, but they are very much connected. So that's like a holistic vision of it, and I like it. I like that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
All right, so we are now at the second block of targets, and this one is about meeting needs. And the full title is Meeting People's Needs Through Sustainable Use and Benefit Sharing. So this block is about benefit sharing, but as a Wolastoqey person, as a First Nation, it makes me wonder what it could mean to talk about benefits in terms of biodiversity, because when I think of my relationship with nature, and with the environment, I don't really think of it in terms of benefits and advantages. You know, it sounds maybe a bit too transactional, just like I'd want to get something out of it. So I'd like to know if you could tell me what you think the benefits could be for First Nations in terms of biodiversity.
Yeah. Well, there were representatives from nearly 200 countries that adopted the text. So even if every word was selected, doesn't mean that it means the same for everyone. And the term benefit is, let's say, put forward, but maybe from the point of view that you're bringing, Andrea, sharing is more the term that should be put forward. So benefit sharing. The first group of targets, 1 to 8, was about reducing the risk to biodiversity. And the second set of targets that we're starting to look at now is about how biodiversity is important to people. And obviously First Nations, but let's say all humans on Earth. And if people start to realize more and more at large that biodiversity is important to them, then maybe they will be more inclined to protect biodiversity. So in that sense, benefit sharing is introducing that concept that we must not only protect biodiversity for itself, but we must protect biodiversity for its, for, let's say, man or humans being part of nature. And that's really bringing forward First Nations values. So we have 3 targets there, and again, the words may, let's say, clash, because when we think about use of species, but we have to think about how they are managed and how they are, let's say, part of human lives, and we must ensure that that can still go on in the very long term. Target number 10 is from a point of view of areas rather than species. So to think that in terms of forestry, in terms of aquaculture, in terms of fisheries, and in terms of farming. So those areas have to be managed in a sustainable manner. So not only manage, let's say, the individual resource, the individual crop, the individual fish stock that we harvest, but we have to think of it as a space to manage and to care about. And let's say in the same line of thought, Target 11 is about ecological services. So we know more and more as climate change is, let's say, operating, how nature has a soothing and protecting function. In terms, well, probably the most obvious example is how it's protecting us from extreme heat, and a canopy, forest cover is bringing shadow, is bringing cooling, including in cities. So Target 11 is about keeping those services that nature is providing us.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand the difference. So we're not talking about benefits like in a monetary sense, but more at large, just to be able to benefit from a healthy environment in which to live and in which to keep your traditional activities going on in your practices. So, okay, I think I get it now. Thank you.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we talked about nature a lot, and you know, when we think of nature, I see those big blue spaces, those big green spaces, but nature is not just those big spaces, and it can also be found in urban areas in the form of urban parks, for example. So I'd like to know if those smaller bits of nature in cities are also addressed by this framework.
Yeah, well, when we're talking about previously ecological services, obviously we're going to see more the benefit of those ecological services in cities where there can be some, let's say, like we were saying earlier, extreme heat, and it's for citizens, people that, let's say, will benefit from a park, being close to their home from walking distance, but also people that don't have homes, so homeless people that need to survive in urban areas during extreme colds in the wintertime, extreme heat in the summertime. So those spaces are providing basically a better quality of life. And it's important that those areas are not only maintained, but increased in cities and in suburbs.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that those parks and those natural spaces in cities, they really do the quality of life of the people around them. And quality of life makes me think about being healthy, you know, just health in general. And it makes me think about medicine. So we know that First Nations use different elements of nature for their medicinal properties. And since it works, sometimes this is something that the pharmaceutical industry is after and is trying to put on their own shelves. So this can lead to a certain appropriation of knowledge, unfortunately. And so I'd like to know if there's something in the framework about those different properties from nature that can be found in different elements.
Yeah, well, when we were talking about benefit sharing, this is let's say a good example where companies have, like you were saying, used traditional knowledge and be able to, let's say, in some instances, genetically sequence what are the active ingredients in medicinal plants, and then to mass produce them and make profits. So the question is not necessarily if that's going to go on or is it going to stop, but how it's going to go on and how First Nations that basically have the knowledge and have, let's say, not only the experience, but know where those plants are. Basically, those profits from the companies could not be made without First Nations, so that those benefits are shared. And it's something that we can think that is more remote from Quebec, that it's more in the tropical forest and the Amazon. But certainly there are issues in Quebec, and it's a target that deserves to be better known and understood how it affects First Nations here.
Yeah, it definitely needs to be more fair in terms of benefit sharing, like you said.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are now at the third and last block of targets for this biodiversity framework, and this one is about tools and solutions for the implementation and mainstreaming. So we've seen the problems that are caused now and that affect our biodiversity, but now it's time to see some solutions, and this framework has some solutions to tell us about. And you know, we know that some actions are already being taken for the implementation of this framework. There's the Quebec government that has its Plan Nature to implement the framework, and we have also the equivalent on the federal side, which is called Toward a 2030 Biodiversity Strategy for Canada. So we can already see that some actors are getting involved in implementing this framework. And so it makes me wonder, on a smaller scale, on an individual level, what is our power of action here? What can we do as individuals to participate in the implementation of this framework?
Well, when we think of it, a lot of the biodiversity crisis is caused by consumption, because we need different products and they have to be produced in areas that were once natural and have been converted, whether they're farmland, whether they're forestry, they're industries. So that's when we have to think about our impact as individual. And our impact is basically what we buy and what we need for our daily life. And we've seen a bunch of targets that require a lot of different qualities, let's say, or different professions or trades. Not everyone can, let's say, run a restoration project or create a protected land, but everyone can consume less. So target 16 is really addressing each and every one of us.
I think it's good to be reminded of that, because this is, you know, looking at what we consume and being more careful of what we consume. This is something that we've already heard of, right, in other situations. But I think it's always good to be reminded of that, because we do have a power of action there. So thank you.
Yeah, well said. Power of action.
And so, just like we said, we do have a power as individuals to act in the implementation of this framework, but we still must not minimize the impact of politics and the role of industry on this biodiversity crisis.
Well, we often think that it's government's job to do things. And there's a place for that in Target 14. But not only on environmental issues, because we often think when there's a problem, well, we have to adopt a new law. And if there's a problem with the environment, then we have to adopt either a new law or strengthen an existing law. But there, let's say, a government will adopt not only laws, but also policies, and policies that are in all different fields of the society, not only in let's say, environmental fields, but they will have an impact on biodiversity. So that's what Target 14 is telling us, is that we have to look first all levels of government, including municipalities, in our, not only our laws, but in our policies, to see what is harmful to biodiversity and what changes can be made, what improvements can be made to those policies, those regulations, those laws, so that they better take into account biodiversity. Target 15 is about businesses, and businesses basically produce different goods, and their means of production can sometimes be harmful to biodiversity. So businesses need to examine how to produce stuff and services for the individual consumers. And obviously, there's going to be still, let's say, impacts on biodiversity. So in their production means, and they have to inform the consumer about how they process stuff and services, and they have to inform the consumer about, and that requires, let's say, just basically being very honest about how they proceed. And basically, it's like, let's say, the other side of the coin of greenwashing, when enterprises are asked to be very honest about their means and to inform people about them.
Yeah, and on the subject of industry, there's also this whole question of funding, because sometimes, you know, it can be part of the solution if we fund some actions that are beneficial to the environment, but sometimes we can also fund some actions that are very much detrimental to biodiversity. And so it makes me wonder if with this framework, we can hope for some more, for some vigilance with funding.
Yeah, well, when we think about funding, we have, let's see, we have two targets there, and that are, again, the coin, let's say the face and the other side of the coin, because that was a big issue at the COP, where, let's say, poor countries were telling rich countries that got rich, often exploiting and overexploiting biodiversity, and let's say bluntly, destroying biodiversity. So they were saying, well, now if you want us, poor countries, to, let's say, do better in producing stuff that, by the way, we're selling to you and you are using, then help us, you know, use all that pile of cash that you've been, let's say, the cash you've been piling over the years, the decades, the centuries, to help us and support us protecting biodiversity. And that brings what, let's say, the other side of the coin, that there are subsidies that can be harmful to biodiversity. Obviously, the oil industry is the obvious example in Canada. And we've seen in the past weeks and months in the medias how important, in terms of dollars, this industry is being supported by public money. So Target 18 is about identifying what are those subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity and reducing them, not basically stopping them at once, but reducing them or reorganizing them so that, let's say, there can be subsidies that will support industries for protecting biodiversity rather than harming it.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to redirect our funding to more green and more positive actions for the environment.
Yeah. Yeah, now we're flipping back the slide.
Yeah, okay, so today we're in 2023 and there's a lot of technological progress. It's going on really fast. And so it makes me think that maybe a part of the solution to this crisis could lie in innovation and technology. What would you say about that?
Yeah, well, that's a whole different field, you know. Within biotechnology can be good, but also we know and more we talk about, let's say, artificial intelligence that's being talked a lot nowadays. So Target 17 is telling us that we have to develop biotechnology, but to remain fully aware that there is a flip side to that coin, and that biotechnology can be harmful sometimes, and that we have to, let's say, develop new measures in terms of biosafety and implement them.
Yeah, I think it's like in everything, there's a balance that we have to maintain.
Yeah.
All right, so no, I think we have to skip another one. Okay. So it's been said before that information and awareness rising could be part of the solution in this crisis, and that they are a key element to fight this crisis. And so do you think it would be helpful to just take the already existing information and make it more widely available?
Well, that brings us on traditional knowledge.
Yeah.
Because scientific knowledge is relatively new, and often scientific studies are very short term, but traditional knowledge brings information back to time immemorial, and it's bringing long sequence in terms of time of information that is extremely helpful to, let's say, and I'm sorry for the word, but better manage fish stocks and animal populations. Now, going back to what we're talking about earlier in terms of sustainable management and sustainable harvest. So traditional knowledge is certainly a key element of Target 21. And it has to be, let's say, gathered, and there's a important link of transmission of information from older people to the youth. And if we now take this principle at large on the planet, then to have information that is accessible, that is reflecting concerns of people and is understandable, it's certainly a key element of the global biodiversity framework.
Yeah, and I do, like you mentioned, I do think that Indigenous knowledge is very rich, very important in everything concerning the environment. And so we would greatly benefit from just knowing more about it and just being more aware and recognize more this form of knowledge.
Definitely.
So this brings us to the last two targets for this framework, and just looking at the titles, which are participation and gender equality, it already makes me think of a good closing for this framework, which tells us that the key to the solution to fight this biodiversity crisis really lies in the participation of all groups of the society in the implementation and in this fight. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. At first, the text of the Global Biodiversity Framework has been, let's say, prepared over months and actually years where it's being developed. And there were originally only 22 targets. There was a 23rd one that was added about gender equality. And if we take those two together, it's about the importance of everyone participating in the framework, not only scientists, not only politicians, not only decision makers, but for, let's say, the population at large to take part in the decision process. And for that to happen, then there must be openness, and there must be, let's say, the possibility of people to actively participate. And that brings us to what we were saying at the beginning of our discussion about the regional nature coordinator's job, which is basically to bring information from the communities to the nature table, and from the nature table to the communities being the young people, the elders, and everyone in the society. So if we're going to be able to reach the targets, and some are pretty highly set, the targets of the framework, it's because it basically rests on everyone's participation.
Yeah, and I think a good way of envisioning that is to say that it's really about gathering around biodiversity and to have just everyone working together, not only in the decision-making process, but also in the implementation of the solutions on the ground. Yeah, so that's something to look for. It makes me very I forgot the word there. Hopeful for the future. Thank you.
We both are.
Yeah. So this is all for the targets for today. We have been through an overview of all the 23 targets. Thank you, Régent, so much for all this information. And thank you, everyone, for watching today's webinar on the Global Biodiversity Framework. I hope that we've been able to answer the question, why should we be interested in this framework? And if you have any questions about its implementation, or you would like to talk about biodiversity with us, or any projects that you have in mind, do not hesitate to contact us. You can email us at conservation@iddpnql.ca. And so thank you, everyone, and have a good day.